Just gonna start recording.
Burning like California, and the wind manipulates the chaos of the flame. There's a wind howling just like Chicago. It fuels and deprives the fire of its air. There's a sun shining like Colorado. It's bright and dry and way up in the sky. Gas lights once hung on these walls. Now current surge inside wires contained. There's an ocean heavy like the air in New Orleans. It hugs like a blanket all around. There's a river rolling like the hills of Pennsylvania, and water survives to tell the tale. There's a water rocking like a thick fog of London. It sways like mesmerizing hymns. There's a love hiding inside. Walls built by fear and pain. Tear 'em down and try to be brave. There's a rock indelible like sounds of Nashville, haunting the corridors at night. There's a mountain crooked as Amsterdam, where buildings lean drunk for centuries. There's a light trapped inside. Current surging and wires contained. The ancient ache of the self-restrained. There's a fire burning like California.
All right. All right. So before the next song starts, all right. Yeah. So thank you, Pat. I just sent Dave the link. There were some folks that still needed the link that are texting in the chat. Thank you guys for doing that. I'm going to go ahead and stop sharing my screen. I wanted to mention that the music we were just listening to was actually, so one of the folks that Kristina wrote about in her book, which we're going to discuss tonight, A New War on Cancer, which is why we're here today. And I want to introduce Kristina Marusic. She is the author of this wonderful book. And I know that some of you folks have read the book. I read the book in preparation for this event, but then also just because I, love Kristina's work, and we're so happy to have her today with us. Thank you so much, Kristina, for joining us.
Thank you so much for inviting me, Jillian. It's great to see you and good to see you all. Thanks for coming.
Yeah, good to see you. And yeah, if you wouldn't mind just sticking, your name in the chat and where you're coming to us from, that would be awesome. I know that we have a couple other people that we're planning to attend here tonight that aren't here yet. So if you guys wouldn't mind just putting, what your name and where you're calling in from, that would be great. And then I'm going to go ahead and make sure everybody is muted except Kristina, because she'll be the one talking. Great. Okay. And if folks have questions during the discussion, then you lost audio. Okay. If folks have questions during the discussion, please put them in the chat. We will go ahead and also we're recording this, so we'll be posting it afterward on our YouTube. So you guys can check that out afterwards, and please share it with friends and family. We're going to have some really great discussion points tonight. And I'm sure that after we're done, like I just got done reading the book yesterday, and we'll have some really good insights when we're finished. So I'm going to hand it over to Kristina for to get started with our discussion tonight.
Thank you so much, Jillian. So I'm going to read from the book. I'll read from chapter 1 of the book for about 10 minutes, and then I'll go through a presentation for about 30 minutes, and then I'll make sure to leave plenty of room at the end for questions. So I'll start with the reading. And again, thank you so much for inviting me to do this, Jillian and Protect PT, and thank you all for being here with me tonight. I really appreciate it. On an 80-degree day that followed a week of snow in late April 2021, I met Barry Breen at a coffee shop in Pittsburgh. She came directly from a hike in a nearby park. Her tank top and neon orange sports bra left the port in her chest exposed, a knotty lump above her left breast. Her frame was slight, and she wore no makeup aside from delicately penciled in eyebrows. We sat on the cafe's shaded patio, sipping cold drinks and marveling over how the sudden shift in weather had changed everyone's mood. People grinned and greeted strangers in a kind of collective exuberance about swapping out coats and boots for shorts and summer dresses overnight, and finally feeling the warmth of the sun for the first time after a long pandemic-addled winter. A journalist colleague who was friends with Barry had connected us, knowing I was writing a book about environmental exposures and cancer. He thought I should hear her story. It was our first meeting, and Barry seemed a little nervous, which she compensated for by talking. I quickly learned that she grew up in Oil City, about 93 miles northeast of Pittsburgh, that Barry was her grandmother's maiden name, that she occasionally meets other women named Barry, B-A-R-I, but had only met one other, Barry, B-E-R-R-Y, and that strangely, they had both worked at the same grocery co-op nearby. She's an artist, a painter, and a musician, and works as a realtor to supplement her income. This is whose songs Jillian was playing when we were waiting to get started. She has a half-sister who's 12 years older than she is, and a brother who's 15 months older. She lives at the top of one of Pittsburgh's many hills with a roommate she described as a chill hippie, meditating, sober, likes to cook. We discovered that we're just 4 days apart in age, both born in March 1984. And she told me that this March, just before her 37th birthday, she'd had surgery to remove a cancerous tumor from her right breast. And then she'd lost 20 pounds and most of her hair while undergoing chemotherapy. Between sips of tea, she showed me the scar from her lumpectomy, a thin red line beneath her right armpit. She also showed me her new hair, taking off her hat and running her fingers over the short brown and gray fuzz that coated her scalp. In September 1993, more than 500 people gathered in downtown Boston for the city's 3rd annual Massachusetts Breast Cancer Coalition March. After the walk, event organizers asked anyone who'd experienced breast cancer to step inside a large outline of the state of Massachusetts they'd painted on the ground. Suddenly, the shape was crowded with bodies, bandanas or headscarves covering heads that were bald from chemotherapy. People cried and clung to their spouses or children. With all these pink ribbons everywhere, it's hard to believe now that not long ago, breast cancer was a hidden disease. Julia Brody, the executive director of Silent Spring Institute, a breast cancer prevention research nonprofit, told me in 2020. In the 1990s, women were just beginning to talk about their experiences publicly and connect with other women who'd had the disease. For many women at that rally, this was the first time they'd ever publicly acknowledged that they'd had breast cancer. It was incredibly emotional seeing that they weren't alone. At the time, the mortality rate from breast cancer was around 31 deaths per 100,000 people in the US, significantly higher than the current mortality rate of 20 per 100,000. The National Breast Cancer Coalition, including the Massachusetts chapter that sponsored the march, circulated a petition urging President Bill Clinton to develop a national strategy to address the disease. I take care of women with breast cancer every day, and I've seen too many patients die. Dr. Susan Love, one of the founders of the National Breast Cancer Coalition, told the Boston Globe reporter who covered the march in 1993. We have to be so obnoxious that they cure this disease just to get rid of us. Their plea was effective. Over the next decade, Congress allocated hundreds of millions of dollars for breast cancer research, and mortality rates dropped by about 24%. But a quieter, parallel movement was also being launched at the same time, one aimed at stopping breast cancer before it started. The Massachusetts Breast Cancer Coalition had been active since 1991, but 1993 was the first year the state had ever published cancer rates by town. The report revealed that 9 towns on Cape Cod had significantly higher rates of breast cancer than the state average. The group called for a scientific investigation into why, but they were frustrated by the lack of existing laboratories capable of performing the investigation. So with a few $1 million in funding from the Massachusetts legislature, they founded their own, bringing in scientists with diverse expertise. They named it Silent Spring Institute in honor of Rachel Carson, whose groundbreaking 1962 book, Silent Spring, brought national attention to the dangers posed by many pesticides, effectively launching the modern environmental movement. Carson died of breast cancer 2 years after her book came out. They were a really remarkable, visionary group of women, Julia said, referring to the activists who founded Silent Spring Institute. Now, they say they were naive at the time and didn't realize how hard that kind of investigation was going to be, but that's lucky. If they had, they never would have achieved so much. When the researchers first went to work trying to figure out why Cape Cod had elevated levels of breast cancer, they quickly discovered the difficulty of such an undertaking. Cancer is a complex disease with many causes, and while scientists generally know how cancer occurs at a cellular level, it's still virtually impossible to trace one person's cancer to one or more specific environmental exposures, let alone tracing exposures from numerous people, all with different health histories and habits. In 1994, only a limited number of studies had set out to do such a thing, so Silent Spring Institute researchers had to develop methodologies as they went. They enlisted help from researchers at Boston University, Tufts, Brown University, and Harvard, and conducted extensive analyses of the cancer data available at the time. They also developed new scientific methods to test air, dust, and urine for chemicals linked to breast cancer risk, then used those methods to test samples from 120 households on Cape Cod. They tested wastewater, groundwater, and drinking water for potentially cancer-causing compounds and conducted interviews with more than 2,000 Cape Cod women, both with and without histories of breast cancer, to collect decades worth of data on risk factors, health histories, habits and activities, and places of residence. The project was so thorough and innovative, according to Brody, that it became a model for environmental health studies across the country. In the end, the researchers didn't find a smoking gun that explained the elevated cancer rates on Cape Cod, but they did find a surprising number and variety of potentially cancer-causing chemicals in most of the homes they looked at. While the study didn't exactly answer the riddle that Silent Spring Institute had set out to solve, the researchers quickly realized their data had much larger implications. Many of the chemicals they found in people's homes came from drinking water contamination and common household products, so it was likely that homes across the country were experiencing similar exposures. But for the most part, no one was looking for them, at least in the United States. They had inadvertently discovered that Americans were being exposed to a host of potentially cancer-causing chemicals and were largely unaware. Once the researchers recognized the scope of the problem, they realized that their work would have greater impact if they focused on helping people avoid these exposures in the first place. So they pivoted from studies that looked backward to ones that looked forward. Today, Silent Spring Institute is staffed by 22 people, most of them women, focused on identifying chemicals that could cause cancer and helping people avoid them. This kind of work requires constant innovation. Current tests to determine whether a chemical causes cancer often require lab animals and are slow and expensive. So Silent Spring Institute scientists are developing new methods to quickly screen thousands of chemicals and identify which are likely to increase breast cancer risk. The organization communicates these findings to the public so we can pressure industries and policymakers to keep harmful chemicals out of food and personal care products. The organization also wants to expand the definition of a carcinogen, moving beyond just chemicals that damage DNA to include things like endocrine disruptors, chemicals that stimulate inflammation, and chemicals that affect the body's immune responses, all of which have been found to raise cancer risk. There's an array of pathways that affect cancer, said Julia, but many chemicals on the market have never been tested for these health effects.
Great. Okay.
Okay, are you seeing my screen?
I am. Yep.
Okay, that was a good breaking point. I stopped reading. We're a couple minutes behind, so maybe I'll hustle through a little bit of the presentation at the end, but I'll go ahead and jump in. Thank you all for coming back. Okay, so this is I'll try to keep this to like 20 minutes so that we have plenty of time for Q&A at the end, but also this is a small group. So if you have questions as I'm going along and you want to raise your hand or jump in, please just feel free to do that. If you invented a pill that could cure 2/3 of all cancer cases, how rich do you think you would be? Do you think you might be like Elon Musk rich or Jeff Bezos rich? And as a follow-up question, if we knew how to prevent 2/3 of all cancer cases, but nobody stood to get rich from it, would you still think we should do it? There's good news about that and there's bad news about that. I'll share the good news first. And the good news is that up to 2/3 of all cancer cases are caused by exposures that we can prevent. That's true. This figure comes from the US President's Cancer Panel, and it's actually conservative. There was another study conducted by researchers at the National Institutes of Health that says 90 to 95% of cancer cases are caused by preventable factors. And there's one theory of cancer risk that I find really helpful when thinking about all this, and this is in the book too, but this idea comes from epidemiology. And this model says that we all have our own pie chart for cancer risk. So our chart might include things like genetic risk factors, exposure to cigarette smoke and air pollution, and exposure to pesticides. And everyone's pie chart is unique with a unique mix of risk factors. But if any one of those risk factors goes missing from your pie, cancer won't develop. And so that would mean that if we can remove even one of the risk factors that's common in a lot of people's pies, we could prevent many cases of cancer, which is a really exciting thought. But then there's also the bad news. And the bad news is that all of our market incentives are pushing us to continue focusing solely on treatments for cancer rather than prevention. This chart is from a market research company that serves investors. And as you can see, the global oncology market was valued at around $280 billion in 2021, and it's expected to reach over $580 billion by 2030. And the box of text on the upper left is from the same web page. And I've highlighted the part where they're citing the fact that cancer cases are expected to rise by 47% from 2020 to 2040 as evidence of strong growth for this market. And unfortunately, there's no similar market projection for cancer prevention. So in other words, a lot of people could get pretty close to Jeff Bezos level rich from investing in treating cancer, but no one stands to make huge profits from investing in cancer prevention. And I want to emphasize that developing new treatments and cures is really important, and I certainly don't mean to imply that it isn't. But while we continue to search for a cure, we also need to do more to prevent cancer. And this means we'll have to rely on forces outside of the marketplace to get this done, because the marketplace isn't gonna handle this one for us. So these are some of the reasons I wrote my book. But like most people, I've also had my own personal experiences with cancer. In 2011, my younger sister, Abby, was diagnosed with thyroid cancer, and she was 25 years old at the time, which is very young for a cancer diagnosis. And thyroid cancer usually runs in families, but no one else in our family had ever had it before, and no one has since. So we were really left wondering whether something in the environment might have played a role in her cancer. I'm also a journalist, as Jillian mentioned, and in 2019, I was still thinking about those questions when I wrote a 5-part series on cancer and environmental exposures in Pittsburgh and Western Pennsylvania titled Prescription for Prevention. These are some of the headlines from that series, and the series directly led to this book. I won a couple of awards for it, and I got a very nice note from a publisher congratulating me and asking if I'd be interested in expanding this reporting into a book with a national focus. And 4 short years later, this is the book. Jillian did a good a great introduction of me, so I won't spend too long on this, but a little more about me. I've been a reporter for environmental health news since 2018, and before that I freelanced covering a wide range of issues for a whole bunch of news outlets. I've won some awards for my reporting on environmental health and justice, and I live in Pittsburgh with my husband Michael and our dog Mochi. And as you can see here, Mochi is a very good dog. Jillian's face. Yeah, she's in the room. She's sleeping over there. I should also mention that my sister made a full recovery. She had her thyroid removed and has been in remission for more than a decade. And this is her with her husband, her two very cute kids, and their goofy golden doodle, who is also a good dog. They live in Wexford, which is near where I live in Pittsburgh. So I get to see her and them all the time. And I'm so grateful that she's okay. I'll also tell you just a little bit more about Environmental Health News, where I work. We're a project of a nonprofit called Environmental Health Sciences, and we're a news organization that was founded by a scientist named Pete Myers, who's an expert in endocrine disrupting chemicals. Our mission is to drive good science and into public policy and public discussion on our environment and our health. And we have some popular newsletters focused on environmental health, including Above the Fold. And we have a Pittsburgh newsletter too, that includes my reporting and a bunch of other environmental health news for the Pittsburgh region. This is a quick overview of the topics I'm going to touch on today. I'm going to keep it moving since we're a little bit behind. So some of the things I learned while I was reporting on environmental exposures and cancer were really shocking to me. And the first was that since we started tracking cancer incidents in the 1970s, rates of childhood cancer have been steadily increasing. This chart is in the United States, but this trend is generally mirrored at the global level. The chart looks the same, it's just a diagonal line across the page. Cancer is now the leading cause of death by disease for children in the United States. From 1975 to 2019, incidence of childhood leukemia, which is the most common type of childhood cancer, increased by 35%. And incidence of childhood brain cancer, which is another common type of childhood cancer, increased by 33%. Nationally, 1 in every 285 American children is now diagnosed with cancer before the age of 20. We've seen a similar increase in some adult cancers that are strongly linked to environmental exposures, including multiple myeloma, non-Hodgkin lymphoma, and testicular cancer. And as you can see, these are substantial increases during that time period. That 76% for non-Hodgkin lymphoma number is pretty alarming. And when I was reporting on that series on cancer and the environment back in 2019, I interviewed a very smart epidemiologist and pediatrician named Dr. Phil Landrigan, who would later end up writing the foreword to my book. And he said something that was a light bulb moment for me. He said that this increase is too fast to be due to genetic changes, because those happen over centuries and not decades. And that our basic diagnostic tools for cancers like childhood leukemia are the same now as they were in the 70s. So this also isn't just a matter of detecting more of something that's always been there. He said this is a real rapid increase in childhood cancer rates that we're seeing. And he said the only other explanation is environmental factors, which means anything that originates outside the body and our own DNA. So that includes things like smoking and diet, as well as exposure to cancer-causing chemicals and pollution. Dr. Landrigan also pointed out that those lifestyle factors like diet and smoking and exercise might play a significant role in adult cancers, but in general, kids aren't engaging in harmful lifestyle behaviors. So this photo is kind of funny because we assume it's a joke, although it was taken in 1955, so who knows. But for the most part, kids are not smoking or drinking, right? Their parents might do those things, but over time, the percentage of parents who smoke and drink during pregnancy has steadily declined, while childhood cancer rates have continued to increase. One thing that has increased over that same time period is the number of chemicals that kids are exposed to on a daily basis. Since the start of the early 20th century, more than 300,000 new chemicals have been invented, and these are all novel materials that never existed before on the planet. Some of them are really helpful and have improved our lives, but most of them have never been tested for safety. And among those that have been tested, most of the ones found to be harmful or carcinogenic are still on the market today. In fact, in the last 50 years, only 5 chemicals have been removed from US markets because they're harmful. The World Health Organization has determined that more than 100 of these manufactured chemicals can cause cancer in humans. This list is not comprehensive, but these are just some of the places we come into contact with these chemicals. And this includes known carcinogens and also some things that are suspected carcinogens. There's also a long list of chemicals we come into contact with on a regular basis. I mentioned endocrine disrupting chemicals earlier, and those cause all kinds of health problems, including increasing our cancer risk. So there's a growing body of scientific literature that links exposure to endocrine disrupting chemicals to cancer in parts of the body that are mediated by hormones. So things like our thyroid, breasts, and prostates. So we tend to get we're seeing links between endocrine disrupting chemicals and breast cancer, testicular cancer, and prostate cancer. This list also doesn't include chemicals that cause non-cancer health harms, and there are lots of those. And again, there are many more chemicals we come into contact with on a regular basis that just haven't been tested for safety, so we don't know yet. Our contact with plastics is another major source of these exposures. A 2021 study by researchers in Switzerland identified more than 10,000 chemicals used in plastic manufacturing and found that about a quarter of them are substances of potential concern, which means that they're endocrine disruptors, or they can cause reproductive damage, that they're toxic to marine life, or that they're carcinogens. And more than half of the chemicals the researchers identified as potentially concerning are unregulated in the United States. Even more alarming, 900 of those chemicals are approved for contact with food in the United States. And at least 1,000 of these concerning chemicals, including some carcinogens, are harmful even in very, very small doses. An additional 39% of the chemicals used in plastics manufacturing haven't been studied enough to determine whether they're hazardous. And I wrote a story recently about a study by a think tank that estimated that lawsuits against the plastics industry for health and environmental harm will exceed $20 billion by 2030. And these are some of the reasons for that. So now that we've seen some of that research, let's talk about how our war on cancer is going so far. We're much better than we used to be at treating cancer, but we're getting a whole lot more of it. At this point, 1 in every 3 Americans can expect to get a cancer diagnosis at some point in their lifetime. And just because we're better at treatments doesn't mean we've solved the problem of cancer. More than 1,000 Americans still die of the disease every day. And treatment is really difficult. Therapies like chemo can have side effects that last for a lifetime, and survivors live with the fear that their disease might come back. I know my sister feels anxiety and deja vu every time she has to go in for a follow-up scan. So we're not winning this war right now. And if this story sounds familiar, you might also be aware of how our war on drugs and our war on poverty are going. The United States has a tenuous history with endless wars of this nature. But the main reason we're not successfully preventing cancer is that we're not funding prevention. Globally, just 7 to 9% of all cancer funding goes toward prevention. I'm a pacifist personally, but if we stick with that war metaphor and we use the more generous estimate of 9%, this would be like spending 91% of our war budget on treating soldiers who came back from the battlefield wounded, and only 9% of our funding on offensive and defensive measures that could have stopped them from getting hurt in the first place. So I suspect none of us here are war experts, but this does not sound like the correct budget for a successful war. So it's time to launch an offensive war against cancer too, in the form of prevention. And the good news is that there are some really smart, really capable people who are already working very hard on this issue. These are some of them who I profiled in my book. And in addition to the funding problems we discussed earlier, another reason it's easier to advocate for a cure than prevention is that it's the nature of prevention that we don't get to know whose life we saved. We're never going to get a heartfelt thank you from the parents we spared the trauma of getting a childhood cancer diagnosis. And it's really easy to feel empathy and want to pitch in when you know who you're fighting for, when you can put a picture of a little girl's face on a t-shirt or a Facebook page and enlist help in her battle against cancer, because who wouldn't want to help in that situation? And the story of prevention is often told through numbers and statistics and long-term cancer trends, which are important, but a lot harder to connect with on an emotional level. And that's one of the reasons I chose to structure my book through profiles of these unlikely heroes who are revolutionizing the way we think about cancer prevention. I wanted to try and humanize these statistics and help people feel connected and inspired when thinking about cancer prevention. In the book, I wrote not just about these people's work, but also their lives. So the family histories, the childhood memories, and the personal challenges that drive them in their work. I read you a little brief section about some of these folks today. You heard about Barry, and you were about to hear about Laurel Shader, although you didn't actually hear her name. And I can share, if we have extra time today, I can share more about some of the Pittsburgh stories that are in the book later. If I told you all these stories right now, my publisher would not be very happy with me. So if you want to know the rest, you have to buy my book. So how can the rest of us join the fight and help out in this revolution? There are lots of different roles that different types of people with different strengths can help play in this movement. I'll briefly talk about 3 broad categories here, but if you can think of additional contributions that aren't listed here, I would strongly encourage you to pursue those and then also tell me about them so I can add them to my slideshow. So number 1 is supporting cancer prevention initiatives aimed at reducing our exposure to harmful chemicals. And one really easy way to do this is donating either time or money to organizations leading this work so we can power up their efforts. Another way is to sign up for these groups' newsletters and follow them on social media so it's easy to quickly act on and amplify their calls to action, which might be things like signing a petition, calling lawmakers about a pending bill, and voting on relevant legislation when it's on the ballot. This is just a small handful of the groups that are leading this work, and there's a much more exhaustive list in the appendix of my book. Number 2 is pushing for better chemical regulations. We can do this by contacting our local, state, and federal lawmakers to let them know that this issue is really important to their constituents and urge them to support better chemical regulations to prevent cancer. You can also sign petitions related to better chemical regulations, and you can sign up for notifications about proposed federal and state regulations related to carcinogens in the environment, then contact key decision makers about these bills when they're up for consideration. And I've listed a couple of websites here where you can sign up for those kinds of notifications. You can also donate time or money to organizations lobbying for better chemical regulations. They include some of the organizations that were listed on the previous slide. And again, there are lots more of those in the appendix of my book. And as you might imagine, the chemical industry has a lot more lobbyists. So you can also support efforts aimed at campaign finance reform, restricting the power of lobbyists, and increasing transparency in the US government. Number 3 is applying market pressure. So I think we're often kind of told that this is our first line of defense as Americans, is to vote with our wallets and be conscious consumers. And I think there's a limited amount we can accomplish through that. But one way to really amplify the power of your consumer choices is to take some extra time to tell both companies why you made a switch from one product to another. So for example, tell company A that you're not buying their hand cream anymore because it uses ingredients that raise your cancer risk, even though you love their hand cream and you've used it for your whole life. and then tell company B you've started buying their hand cream instead because it's free of those ingredients. That really can amplify the impact of just making the switch. If you have investments, including retirement accounts, you can also leverage those to increase market pressure on an even larger scale. Many of the cancer-causing chemicals we come into contact with in our daily lives come from fossil fuels. So you can apply market pressure by divesting from fossil fuel companies and investing in companies that are advancing green chemistry and sustainable climate solutions. And finally, you can also help spread the word and get others to join us in this fight by reading and sharing my book. And I like to close with this quote by the cultural anthropologist Margaret Mead, because it always makes me feel ready to fight. You can read my book to learn more about the heroes who are already doing incredible work to protect us all from cancer and revolutionize this war. And please find your own ways to join the movement and help out.
Thank you, Kristina. Yeah, and we have a few questions from the audience. And when I was finishing the book, which I love how it ended, by the way, I encourage everybody to read it to get to the end, because I thought that was like my favorite part. Particularly how the stories end, but also the epilogue was really wonderful. And I think that you kind of encapsulated that in the last part of your presentation. And so when I was done reading, I was like, you know what, we really need to kind of pull some of these resources out. So I'm going to go ahead and put a couple things in the chat. This one, we kind of thought, what are some actions that people can take? And thank you to Tom for helping me put these things together. But the first one, we actually, coincidentally, there was in your story, in the beginning of the book, you were talking a little bit about medical devices and how they're made, and some of the impacts to the communities around these places. And just so happens yesterday, this popped up on my email. And I'm going to go ahead and put some of the links in the chat for you. But the EPA is proposing new regulations to reduce cancer risks from ethylene oxide sterilization facilities, which you talk about in your book. And I thought, how timely is this email that I'm getting? And so we did some research, and those are some links that we found. So that is one. And then the next one it's so funny that you mentioned researching your products, because just the other day, my daughter, and I think it's because she heard me, I did the downloaded version on Audible. So I could listen to it in the car. And so every time I'm taking the kids to their guitar lessons and stuff, I'm listening to this. And so in response to this, my daughter found this app that she could download that told her how good or bad the products that we have in our house are. and she's 12, by the way. And so after that, she said, Mom, I think some of these companies pay to be on this site and say that their products are good. And I'm thinking that maybe some of their products are not so great. So Tom was able to get me another great link to this organization that does look into this stuff. And so I wanted to put that in the chat. And then finally, this is my favorite. And really, I feel like I really connected with the Melanie's story and the story that of her community around Claritin. And I won't tell any more, because I think that folks should read the book to learn for themselves about Melanie's story. But fighting for change is really important. So that is our last link there. And I'm going to go ahead and put the link to our volunteer form in the chat, so people can sign up to volunteer to help make that systemic change. So I wanted to open it up to folks that had questions, and there are people that submitted questions ahead of time to Kristina, so we can discuss those as well.
Hi, Lois, go ahead.
I wonder, as a retired respiratory therapist, we used to do a lot of sterilization. We did a cold sterilization. I knew about ETO already, and the value of autoclaving certain things, but certain things you can't. We did a cold sterilization with glutaraldehyde. And we used to put our bare hands in this stuff, this was back, I'm ancient. And I think that's carcinogenic as well. Is that mentioned at all in the literature? I think it is.
I'm not familiar with glutaraldehyde,
Okay.
so I don't know on that one. Or if
Okay,
it's
probably is. Too late now.
It says, CDC says there's animal studies have not found evidence that glutaraldehyde causes cancer. We do not know whether it might cause cancer in people, but that's better news than it's super carcinogenic.
Yeah, because man, I'll tell you, we were in it. Okay, thanks.
Thanks, Lois, for that question. Also, we had some people that posed some questions ahead of time on our forum. So thank you for those who did that. And Kristina, I just put those questions in the chat for you. I know that you had answered them a little bit on our sheet that we had our agenda for today. But so the first one was just, are any of the organizations working at the federal level to try to set up kind of FDA for chemical manufacturers?
I love that idea. If anyone is working on that, I did not come across it. I think all of the groups that are working on this issue are really working to get our existing agencies to do what they're supposed to do and enforce existing regulations. And one problem we have is that the EPA and other regulatory agencies, but in particular the EPA, has been under-resourced, under-financed, and understaffed for decades. And they just physically cannot keep up with the pace of chemical manufacturing. And so I think it's maybe seems like a bigger lift to ask for a new agency to be created than it might be to fund the EPA and give them adequate, resources to be able to enforce the environmental regulations we have on the book. And they're also falling way behind on enforcing new regulations. They're supposed to reassess chemicals periodically and create new guidelines for industry and new regulations. And the agency is getting sued by a bunch of environmental and health advocacy groups because they have just failed to do that repeatedly. Like this, you mentioned, you put a link in about how they're proposing updated regulations on ethylene oxide. They're about 15 years behind what they're supposed to be according to their mandate on doing that ethylene oxide. So yeah, I love that idea. I think we might have more traction with funding our existing agencies.
Yeah, for sure. The second question was there any linkage to past President Nixon's decision to start EPA and his National Cancer Act of 1971? That's a good one.
Yeah, so I didn't talk specifically about Nixon in the book. The National Cancer Act of 1971, from what I understand, primarily kind of set up and funded our big cancer treatment research agencies and organizations at the federal level, which, they've accomplished a tremendous amount since they were established in the 70s. We've dropped the mortality rate from most cancers by a really substantial amount because we put lots of funding and energy into treatments. Where they're lacking is in prevention. And I did write in the book about the federal cancer moonshot, And the current draft proposal for Biden's new edition of the moonshot is the first one. I think the moonshot's been around for 50 years too. And this is the first time it has ever mentioned prevention in a way that goes beyond early detection, which is not actually prevention, right? It's not actually trying to stop cancer, it's just trying to catch it earlier. So I think that is significant. And there are lots of advocates who are working behind the scenes to try and advocate for a more robust explanation in the moonshot right now about what prevention entails, and to get specific funding and specific plans in place focused on preventing exposure to environmental chemicals. So it's a big deal that it mentions it, and it also doesn't go quite as far as advocates would like. So still lots of work to be done at the federal level. We are seeing some really exciting developments at the state level when it comes to regulating harmful chemicals right now. Just this last week, Washington State passed a really sweeping ban on a bunch of carcinogens in consumer products, including cosmetics, electronics, and furniture. And we're seeing lots of states step up their regulation of PFAS. Colorado last year passed the most extensive PFAS ban in the country, banning it in all kinds of consumer products. And Michigan also just passed a big PFAS ban that essentially bans all non-essential uses of PFAS, which are per and polyfluoroalkyl substances. They're also called forever chemicals, and they also are associated with higher cancer risk. So I know it can feel kind of daunting to wait for change at the federal level because that tends to happen so slowly, but we're really seeing states step up on this issue right now in a way that I think is really exciting and kind of indicates that the tides are turning.
And in some of our work, Kristina, with fracking, PFAS is a huge issue that we deal with. And there are some senators, Senator Katie Muth and Representative Sarah Innamorato, who may be our new county executive, perhaps, hopefully, in Allegheny County here. But just want to mention that they had proposed a bill a few years ago about closing the waste loophole, and really just the goal of that is to add transparency to this PFAS chemical stew that is used in fracking, and there's some papers that have come out about PFAS from the Physicians for Social Responsibility. They have a pet paper about forever chemicals, and actually we are going to be hosting one of the authors of that report, Dusty Horowitz, and PSR in the fall, because they're actually coming out with a new paper on Pennsylvania and PFAS around fracking in Pennsylvania. So everybody could stay tuned for that. But one of the things that I thought was interesting, and this kind of made me think about this when I was reading the book, and I don't know if I'm getting the word soup correct. Was it Tosca that you were talking about? And can you explain Tosca a little bit to folks and what that is?
Yeah, Tosca is, let me find these, is the Toxic Substances Control Act. So the acronym is actually TSCA, but people pronounce it Tosca. And Tosca was originally passed in 1976 and has gone through a couple of overhauls in recent years. But there are advocates who've consistently said that even with the updates, there was a big one called the Lautenberg Amendment that happened under Obama that tightened some toxic chemical regulations. But in general, there are still a lot of complaints that Tosca is a little too lax. There's also some concern that Tosca can preempt local regulations. So I heard anecdotes about like municipalities trying to regulate pesticide use, and getting told by pesticide companies or companies that were applying them, you actually can't restrict our use of these chemicals because these are regulated under federal law, and that preempts local legislation, and the federal law says nothing about like whatever pesticide this is. So there are lots of advocates who are kind of constantly working to try and improve TSCA. It's good. It's another one of those things where like it's a net good, it's important, but it could be better. And they're fighting to make it a little more comprehensive.
Yeah, it's interesting about the preemption topic you were talking about, because I always thought that the federal government or the federal laws were meant to be the floor, and that states had the power to enact laws that were more stringent than the federal laws. So if these, if these substances are not covered or are covered in a certain way, wouldn't you think that every individual state would be able to enact more stricter regulations?
You would hope so. I think it depends on the judge, and the specific one I heard about was happening like at a municipal level. So I guess it might go differently if you got to like a state Supreme Court. But they were being told that like, it's similar to how communities have a hard time stopping fracking permits, right? Because they're told like, well, the state regulates this, so you don't get to have a kind of de facto ban on fracking in your community.
Yeah, that's interesting. Well, do other folks have questions? I want to open it up to anybody that might have questions.
Lois asked, how likely are we to get rid of the Halliburton loophole? I don't know. That's certainly a tough one. One thing I think is promising on this front is that we're getting access to a lot more data related to the harms caused by the Halliburton loophole. I recently did a story about a study that looked at the volume of chemicals that should have been regulated under the Safe Drinking Water Act, but weren't, that were used by fracking companies as a result of the Halliburton loophole. And it's the first time anyone has ever tried to do a study like that, because it's really difficult to get the data on that in a national way that you can analyze in a systemic fashion, because the fracking disclosure database is kind of intentionally set up to obfuscate national trends. So you can get data for like a single well at a time, or maybe for a state, but it's really hard to parse. So this guy who has a background in programming made an open source software that makes that data accessible. He told me when I was writing the story that he had to account for 84 different spellings, misspellings, and abbreviations for Halliburton, for example, for you to be able to enter Halliburton as a keyword and pull up all the fracking wells that were buying fracking fluid from Halliburton. So before he made this, you just like couldn't query the system for that. There was no way to know. And unsurprisingly, they found that, well, the most common supplier of fracking fluids is unknown or unlisted, but the second most common is Halliburton. So Halliburton loophole exists specifically for Halliburton, and they are in fact profiting the most from its existence because they sell most of fracking fluids. But I think having this data be accessible, that's really new. That's like this year new. And now all of these researchers across the country who are interested in fracking chemicals are going to be able to do similar studies. And I think, it's frustrating that we continue to be asked to generate more and more data on this when we already know the health harms of fracking so intimately. But I do think that having the ability to do this kind of big picture systemic analysis of fracking chemicals, and specifically related to potential harms caused by the Halliburton loophole, might help nudge that along and raise awareness about the need to close the Halliburton loophole.
Yeah. Please. If other folks have questions or comments, please take yourself off mute. I mean, I could talk all day about what I think about the Halliburton loophole and and fracking. And I mean, but I really liked that your book really had this weaving of media, personal awareness, and scientific research, and how that can lead policy and change. That was one comment that I had about that I was just thinking about when I was reading the book. I really enjoyed that aspect of the stories that you told.
Thank you. Yeah, I really wanted it to feel, there's a lot of long chemical names in there. And so I really did my best to make it readable and compelling. So it didn't feel, academic. And that's another reason I wanted to include people's stories, was because I think it can be easy to forget that these issues are about humans who have their own lives and stories and rich histories and, lives that are worth protecting and preserving.
Yeah, for sure. All right, who else has a?
Oh,
Oh, go ahead. Go ahead, Lois.
now, I think of, well, I thought of a lot of things because I saw the replay of the Lunch and Learn yesterday, and I didn't realize that Shell had approached having their cracker plant in, was it Finland or was it the Netherlands? They were offshore, and their requirements were, sure, you can if you have zero emissions. So naturally, it was so much easier to come to Pennsylvania and Beaver County. And then I saw the enormous amount of, I think they called them cans. Anyway, the VOCs that were just being spewed out. And also you brought up in that, there were standards of air quality that, had it been just a little higher, would have negated, they wouldn't have met the criteria to build the Shell cracker plant. And that's a lot to address there. But if we wanted to address why didn't we, look at the standards today, just take a look at my Purple Air reader and everywhere from Michigan down to West Virginia, because my friends were going to stop by here, and they bypassed us and went home to Sarasota. And she said she had never seen such a toxic load in the air. And I said, I've never measured it. I've never had a bronchitis because, like, as bad as I got now from it. But who do you address in terms of the criteria? How do you find out what the criteria would have been for that Shell plant? I mean, that could be, there could be standards that,
Yeah. I mean, I think we would have to probably talk to maybe some of the people that researched why that was not approved in I think it was Finland. I can't remember.
I seem to remember Finland.
Yeah. So what Lois is talking about is our Lunch and Learn from yesterday. Thank you, the Netherlands. Our Lunch and Learn from the yesterday, and the topic was so interesting, and relevant to the conversation today with the new war on cancer, which is the Beaver Cracker plant, which Kristina, I know you mentioned that in your book. And it was just about some of the pollution events that have been happening since the cracker plant was, went online. I mean, it's still in like this, coming online phase, and they have had 11 notices of violation. And I think there was something where the first couple of days they went online, they were in exceedance of their yearly values of pollution that was allowed just within a first day or two of operation. They had exceeded their whole year's allotment of pollution, which I think is crazy to think about.
Yeah, it's really alarming. I did write about, I've done pretty extensive reporting on the ethane cracker, and I talk about it some in the book, to talk about the connection between the climate crisis, the plastics crisis, and our rising cancer rates and the connection between the fracking industry and the plastics industry and these cancer-causing emissions. And I used the Shell plan as an example of that.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, so we had, just for folks to let people know, we had the lunch and learn on Shell yesterday. I also want to put in the chat the lunch and learn we had with Kristina last month, which was also really, really good. And some of the reporting that she did, we got some updates on some of the reporting that she's been doing with that lunch and learn, and we were able to also tell folks about tonight's event. So if you go to our YouTube channel, you can find all of those lunch and learns and learn more about the work that Kristina does. We're at 7:03 right now, so I just want to see if anybody else has any questions before we spin the wheel and get a winner for a free book.
Jen put one in the chat. She said the 76% increase in non-Hodgkin's lymphoma since 1975 is really stunning. Are there any theories as to why there's been such a dramatic increase? Non-Hodgkin lymphoma is really strongly associated with environmental exposures. So there might be other reasons, but my hunch is that it's related to a kind of ever-growing quantity and doses of these exposures that we're getting throughout our lifetime. There's also, I discuss pretty extensively in my book, there's emerging, this is so cool, I love that you made this, Julian. There's emerging research indicating that your parents and even your grandparents' exposures can influence your cancer risk for childhood cancer and your risk of developing cancer as an adult. So we're seeing generational effects of these exposures. So there could be other reasons. Again, I didn't dig into those since my book is focused on chemicals and exposure, but I suspect that's playing a substantial role in the increase in non-Hodgkin's lymphoma.
Thank you for that question, Jen. All right, so we're going to spin the wheel and see who's going to win a copy of the book. Trisha, you're the winner. Okay.
Wow, that is so fun, Jillian. I love that you did that. Congratulations, Trisha.
All right, okay. And Kristina, do you have a link for other folks that weren't as lucky as Trisha to be able to buy the book?
Yeah.
And
in fact, I can also offer, if you, since you attended today, here's a link to buy the book directly from the publisher, Island Press. It's also on Amazon and it's in Barnes & Noble. But if you buy it here from Island Press and you use the discount code webinar, it'll be good for 30% off, which is a pretty big discount. So if you buy directly from Island Press and use webinar, it'll be 30% off. And then I'll also make a request. Jillian, I'm so thrilled you listened to the audiobook because I got to help pick the narrator and I love audiobooks. So it was like very exciting for me to have my book turned into an audiobook. If you have the capacity to leave a review, that really helps people listen to audiobooks. And if others read the book, if you have the capacity to leave a review on Amazon or on Goodreads, you don't have to have bought it from them to do that, but reviews really help. So if you read it, please leave a review.
Yes, I will do that right now.
Did the link for the book include the audiobook too?
I don't have a discount code for the audiobook. The audiobook is available directly through Audible, or you could find it through your library or anywhere else you get audiobooks. You should be able to find it.
Yeah, I'm not sure if they have it on Spotify, but I just downloaded it on Audible, and I want to say it was like, I don't remember how much the book is online, which of course we bought a couple copies to share with people. Also, we have a resource library at our office for folks that are local. If you want to come, we purchased 3 copies and we're going to give away 1 copy. Actually, we probably have a couple other ones floating around here. But if you want to borrow the book, you can come to Protect BT's library. We have this book and other books that we have purchased and acquired over the years that talk about these wonderful subjects like Kristina wrote about. And my Audible, I have a subscription, so to buy an additional credit, because I did not have a credit to use, I bought an additional credit. It was like $15.99. So not too bad. And so definitely you can sign up and get that if and I will definitely leave a review. I didn't even think about that.
Thank you.
Also, if you do get the book from like another retailer, leave a review there, because I think that that'll just help Kristina get the word out some more. And if you don't know about our website, and if you're not a member of Protect PT, you can become a member and support the work that we're doing. Membership helps us to fund projects like these and fund the work that we're doing. I just put the link in the chat to our membership. And we have a lot of fun events like this. And I want to thank Kristina for being here tonight. And I know that you've had a lot of requests for appearances with this new book. And we really, consider you a friend of ours to be here and to be sharing this information. And I think it's just really important for people to know, because there are things that we can do. And I think it's so backwards the way that our system is made right now. It's crazy that we are focusing on curing cancer and not prevention to cancer. It was completely 2/3, completely potentially preventable cancer. And thank you everybody for joining us tonight. Really excited to have everybody here, and enjoy the rest of your evening, and try not to spend too much time outside. I know that's hard to say, but here in Southwestern PA, it is very smoky. The air is very, very bad. So thank you guys.
Thank
have a
you.
wonderful evening.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Kristina.
Thanks,
Take care.
everybody.
Bye.
Bye-bye.